Alright, so with this particular element of art, we're talking about the element of art that is known as space. And we're going to have a lot more to learn here with this particular section than certainly the previous section here. And so I thought I'd give kind of an overview of what we're going to go over here. There's three basic sections: the basic perspective, the second section is a linear perspective, and the third one is the atmospheric perspective. With the first one, basic perspective, that's just based on how we see things. And the same thing with the other types of perspective, but with linear perspective, we're really talking about how we lock objects into space correctly, and we use sight lines to do that, which is where linear comes into play there. And then atmospheric is based on what the atmosphere does to the way that we see things. Okay, so let's look at basic perspective first. Alright, so this is a good straightforward example here of basic perspective. The first thing is that we notice objects, the further away they get from us, the smaller they get. For instance, if we look at the people on the left-hand side, the further away they get, the smaller they are. The closer they get to us, the larger they are. Same thing with the light posts that we see there as well. Okay, so that's simple enough. That size, that diminishing size, is one aspect of this basic perspective. The second thing that we notice about this image here in terms of basic perspective is that the farther away something is, the higher on the picture plane it is. The lower something is on the picture plane as far as it being anchored down, then the closer it is to us. So again, all we have to do is look at the people there on the left, and the farthest people away are higher on the picture plane as far as where they're anchored down there, as we see as the people come closer and closer to us, they get lower and lower on that picture plane. Okay, and the last part of basic perspective here would be overlap. That we can't see through objects, and so the objects that are closest to us are going to overlap those objects behind us. Okay, so obviously we don't see the light posts behind those children there in the middle, or those children in the background, because they are overlapped by the children themselves. Okay, so it's those three things: a diminishing size, overlap that I just mentioned, as well as the vertical positioning or placement of the objects themselves. Okay, so those three things basically make up this section that we call basic perspective. The next section is a little bit of a longer section because we have three different parts of it, and it's called linear perspective. This is also referred to as scientific perspective sometimes. And again, it's based on the way that we actually see things. Okay, so there's going to be 1-point linear perspective, there's going to be 2-point linear perspective, and there is going to be 3-point linear perspective. Okay, so let's look at the first one, 1 point. Alright, with 1-point linear perspective, the first thing we're going to notice here is that we have a horizon line. Okay, a horizon line is basically where the sky meets the earth. That you walk out anywhere, and that point where the sky meets the earth is the horizon line. And the way that we lock objects into space using this perspective is that we, for instance, if we look on the left, we look at that little cube, we see the edges of the cube, they merge back to the same point. Okay, we call that the vanishing point because that's where the sight lines recede to, and that's where they vanish on that horizon line. And so with this particular perspective, this works when an object is basically straight in front of us, because the vertical lines are going to remain vertical. They're going to remain pretty constant. And so all we really have to worry about here are the side angles. Those are the ones that diminish. And so if we look at those sides, the top and the bottom, they all go to that same vanishing point. And so if an object is right in front of us, parallel to us, this 1-point perspective works pretty well. And so we see on the right an example of that. That's Raphael's School of Athens. And if you notice two details here with the School of Athens. So I want you to pay attention to the floor plan on the bottom. If you line up the edges of that floor plan, where the little square designs are there on the bottom, and you line up the sides of that, you'll see that they all recede to one point in between those two figures in the middle. Okay, so that would be where the horizon is. If you look at where those figures are, above them you can see the sky. Below them you can see that that's where the Earth would be, because that's where they're standing on. And so that's where that horizon line would be, straight across there. And that vanishing point is always going to be on the horizon line here. And so you notice that if you follow the floor plan down to that center of the composition. And the other thing is, if you look at the top where the architecture is, you can see where the ceiling is on the top. There are some spans of columns that are holding up that ceiling. And so if you look at those spans of columns and you find that line that those columns all go to that hold up the ceiling, and you trace that line on down on both sides, you'll see that they also converge to that same spot there in the middle between the two figures in the middle. And so again, floor plan on the bottom, the architectural elements on the top, they all recede to that one vanishing point of those two figures there in the middle. So that's why this is an example of one-point perspective, because it all neatly converges to that one point, since we are basically straight in front of it in terms of its perspective. Now, that's not going to work with all objects, because not all objects are necessarily going to be directly in front of us. We might get kind of an oblong look at something, or something that's not going to be perfectly parallel with us. And so if we look on the left, that's a pretty good schematic approach to what we're talking about here. We see not the flush side of something, but we see a corner. And so when that happens, we have to use two-point perspective. The big difference between two-point perspective and one-point perspective is we have two vanishing points. Okay, and those vanishing points are again going to be located on the horizon line, but because there's two of them, it's called two-point perspective. So that's simple enough there. And so if we look at the artwork on the right, we can see that those buildings aren't, we don't see that broad side of things as if something was directly in front of us. We have that that angle or that corner that would be looking at us. So we have to use two-point perspective in that case. Okay. Now there is something called three-point perspective. You don't see it as much, but you will see it kind of in extreme cases. And actually, one-point perspective is kind of a simplification, but it actually works pretty well, because most of the time when we're looking at objects, it's not at an extreme angle, and so those vertical lines really don't vary too much. But with really weird perspectives like a bird's eye view or a worm's eye view, you'll need to use three-point perspective to get it to lock into shape properly. Okay, so we see our little schematic here on the left. And again, this shows those two cases that I talked about. If you're really low or you're really high, those vertical edges are going to either come in or come out. And so that's where we would use this three-point perspective, and that's where that third point would come in. It would be on those verticals, where in one-point and two-point perspective, those verticals are just pretty much steady most of the time. And so we have an example of that on the right. We have M.C. Escher's print here, this little drawing of this building, and you can see we have this aerial view of it. And so because of that aerial view, we notice that it's larger on the top than it is on the bottom, so we have to get that third point in there for that type of perspective. And you can see his looks pretty convincing as far as this type of perspective goes, because of the odd angle. We use that three-point perspective, and it works pretty well for this. And so these are different types of perspective. Remember, in all of these things, we will have a horizon line. It's going to be consistent, and then basically the number of points we have as far as vanishing points, that's going to dictate what point perspective it is. Okay, this is an example of an optical illusion that shows just how ingrained perspective is to us. For instance, in this one, you can see that obviously here the man all the way to the left looks way larger than the man here all the way on the right. But if you were to actually measure, and feel free to do so if you want on your screen there, you'll see that all the men here are actually the same size as far as how big that they are drawn. That the third man looks larger because we know he should be getting smaller the further away he is getting to us. But since he's not drawn that way, then it gives us this kind of weird optical illusion. It's the same kind of concept that we see when people play with it, kind of in family photos, like we see here, where someone would be, you know, like we see here, kind of holding up or kind of pinching in this Eiffel Tower, as we see here. And if we'll go back to basic perspective, you would know that obviously the Eiffel Tower is going to be a lot larger than someone's hand, but based on our perspective here, it doesn't look that way. And so you might see some kind of funny family photographs from kind of playing with this particular concept of someone like stomping on the Golden Gate Bridge or something along those lines. All right, so that is perspective and those sight lines that we use to get that right perspective to lock objects into shape. Because they're sight lines, that's where the term linear comes from. Okay, the term atmospheric perspective, and this is called atmospheric perspective because it's based on what the atmosphere does to the way that we see things. Okay, it's basically three things again here, and all of these three things are going to be more the closer to the viewer and less the farther away from the viewer. Okay, so the first thing is what we call value range. Okay, value range refers to light versus dark. That's what value means in art. And we'll define that a little bit more later in this course. But when we're talking about value range, we're talking about really lights and really darks. And so if you look at this picture, all the things in the foreground where the sunlight's hitting it, and certainly in the men on the ledge there, you can see all the trees, all the vegetation. You can see a lot of those things there. We have a really big value range. We have light lights, really dark darks. Now, if you notice in the second little ledge, we have a little bit less of that. You go to kind of the third mountain over there, and you have even less of it. Fourth mountain back, or hill back there, you'll see less of it. And then on back through the hills, you'll see progressively less and less value range, to where when we see that last hill there, it's basically just one value. It's one kind of color, one kind of tone. Okay, so the first thing is value range. We see more of that the closer, less of that the farther away. Okay, the next thing is detail. We see a lot more detail the closer up it is. If we had two people all the way on that far mountain, we wouldn't even be able to see them because they're so far away. But them being really close up, we can see that type of detail. Okay, so that's the second thing, detail. More of it the closer you are, or the closer the object is in the composition, and then less of it the further and further and further away from the viewer you get. Okay, so after value range and after detail, the last thing is color intensity. Okay, and so these will make a little bit more sense once we actually go over color, which will be a section that we'll get to either later this week or early next week. But color intensity basically refers to the brightness of a color. And so you can see in the foreground we see a lot of intensity with our colors. We have really bright yellows, bright greens, bold blacks and browns, a lot of color intensity. And that gets less and less and less as we go further and further back in those hills. We still see a little bit of green in that right hill, and then it gets kind of grayer and grayer and duller the further back we go. Okay, so that's that third aspect of atmospheric perspective, that things get grayer and duller. The further back you get, they get less and less intense in terms of color. Okay, so it's those three things again: color intensity, value range, and detail. More of it the closer, less of it the further away from the viewer. And if we look at this example here, this is another example of the same idea, the same concept. The previous painting that we looked at was an example of a landscape painting from the 1800s. This is an example of modern computer animation. And you see in the effort to get things to look pretty realistic, which it does, and certainly computer technology gives us some ability to do that in ways that we didn't earlier. And we see here, this is a pretty good example of something that looks fairly realistic. And again, it's based on this atmospheric perspective, that the further back those buildings go, the less detail that we see. And we can see quite a lot of detail here in the foreground, but once we get to those buildings way in the back, we can barely see anything. Okay, so we see that detail, value range, as well as the intensity of the color itself. We can see how that definitely changes in terms of the distance to the viewer here. And we might see, for instance, in this last painting, how artists can really manipulate this type of thing. This is, I thought, a pretty cool example here from a modern painting here, where the artist is being really kind of intentional as far as really blending those back buildings into the background there, and being a lot more detail oriented with passages a little bit closer to the viewer than the passages that are further away. Okay, so this is something that we can notice in things that you know, even things like this that involve a little bit more, I guess, of an artistic touch, a little bit of I guess, a emotion, a little style to it. And so this is a good example here again of how atmospheric perspective might be utilized by an artist to enhance his or her artwork. All right, that's it for perspective. Let's go back up to this particular page here, and we can kind of recap here the basic perspective, the linear perspective, and the atmospheric perspective here of what here is going to be important to know in this particular section. All right, so that does it here for the first few art elements, and the next one is going to be time and motion.